A visitor from the stars. The sun was dipping below the horizon, casting long shadows across Edward Cole's isolated farmland. At 72, the retired aerospace engineer turned farmer found solace in the simplicity of rural life. His days were spent tending to his modest crop fields and caring for his aging dog, Rusty. The silence and routine of the farm provided a stark contrast to the hectic life he had left behind. But tonight, the silence was shattered. Edward was finishing his evening chores when a sharp, unnatural sound tore through the air. It was not thunder, though the rumble carried an otherworldly power that vibrated deep in his chest. The skies above his wheat fields flickered with lights that resembled neither stars nor lightning. Startled, he grabbed a flashlight and headed toward the source of the disturbance. As he approached the far edge of his property, Edward's heart skipped a beat. A metallic craft, sleek and iridescent, was embedded in the soil, steam hissing from its sides. The sight reminded him of the advanced prototypes he had once worked on during his aerospace days, but this was far beyond anything humanity had built. His logical mind raced to make sense of the anomaly, but his thoughts were interrupted by a soft sound, a groan, faint but undeniably human-like. He stepped closer and found her. A young woman, or so she appeared, was crumpled near the base of the ship. Her skin shimmered with an opalescent glow, and her hair, impossibly long and flowing, seemed to shift colors with each flicker of the dying light. Despite her alien appearance, her face bore an expression of unmistakable pain. Edward knelt beside her cautiously. "Hey, are you okay?" His voice was steady, but his pulse quickened. The woman's eyes fluttered open. They were unlike anything Edward had seen, large, luminous, and filled with a kaleidoscope of colors that seemed to shift with her emotions. She whispered something in a language he couldn't comprehend, the sounds melodic but strange. Then, as if sensing his confusion, she pressed a small device on her wrist. The next words she spoke were in broken English. "Help, danger, please." Edward hesitated, glancing back at the darkened horizon. He knew his farm was miles from the nearest neighbor, let alone any kind of help, against his better judgment. But driven by an instinct he couldn't explain, he offered her his hand. "All right, let's get you out of here." She was light, almost unnaturally so, as Edward helped her to her feet. Her breathing was shallow, and her movements were unsteady. He wrapped his coat around her and led her toward the farmhouse, his mind racing with questions. What was she running from? Why had she chosen this remote place to land or crash? Inside, Edward settled her on the old couch in his living room. The woman winced as she adjusted her position, revealing a deep gash on her arm. A faintly glowing liquid seeped from the wound, unlike any blood he had ever seen. He grabbed a first aid kit, his hands trembling as he applied pressure to the wound. "Thank you," she murmured. Her voice, though distorted by the translation device, carried a warmth that surprised him. "Name, Elira." "Edward," he replied simply. "You've got a lot of explaining to do, Elira." But before she could answer, a deep hum resonated through the house. It wasn't coming from her craft. It was something in the sky. Edward stepped to the window, his heart sinking as he saw a series of faint red lights blinking in a slow, deliberate pattern. Whatever had brought Elira here wasn't done with her yet. "What are those?" he asked, turning back to her. Elira's face was pale, her luminous eyes wide with fear. "Hunters," she whispered. "They're coming for me." Edward gritted his teeth, his mind flipping into survival mode. He might have retired to a quiet life, but the years of engineering and problem-solving had honed his instincts. "Well, they're not going to find you here," he said firmly. As the hum grew louder, Edward began locking doors and pulling down the blackout curtains he hadn't used in years. Elira struggled to her feet, her resolve seemingly returning. "I can't stay," she said, her voice trembling but determined. "They will not stop." Edward turned to her, his expression hardening. "Then we make them stop." For the first time that night, A flicker of hope appeared in Alira's kaleidoscopic eyes. She nodded, and together, they began preparing for the confrontation that neither of them had ever imagined. The hunters close in. The farmhouse stood quiet under the cold Nebraska night, but the stillness was a facade. Inside, Edward and Alira worked quickly, the air tense with urgency. The faint hum of the approaching hunters reverberated like an ominous drumbeat. Edward's mind raced as he rummaged through his dusty workshop, gathering supplies. Years of tinkering and repairing old machinery had left him with a treasure trove of odds and ends. Now, they might just save their lives. "What do these hunters want from you?" Edward asked, glancing at Alira as she stood in the dim light of his workshop. Her holographic camouflage flickered for a moment, revealing her true form before stabilizing. The faint glow of her skin gave her an ethereal appearance, but her expression was all too human, fear mixed with determination. "They are mercenaries," Alira explained, her voice steadier now. "They hunt for profit. My research, it contains data on species vulnerabilities, ecosystems, resources. They could weaponize it, destroy entire civilizations." She looked directly at Edward, her kaleidoscopic eyes piercing. "If they capture me, countless lives will be lost." Edward's jaw tightened. He didn't fully understand the scope of what she was saying, but he recognized the stakes. He pulled out an old soldering iron and a handful of circuits. "Then we'd better make sure they don't get you." Alira tilted her head, watching him with curiosity. "What are you doing?" "Improvising," Edward replied. "If they're coming, we'll give them a welcome they won't forget." The makeshift defenses. Edward's plan was simple: create confusion, buy time. He rigged an array of old tools and wires to the farm's generator, creating a makeshift electromagnetic pulse. "This won't fry their ship," he admitted, "but it might mess with their tracking systems long enough for us to think of something better." Meanwhile, Alira busied herself with modifying her bracelet. The device emitted a soft hum as she worked, her fingers moving with a precision that Edward found mesmerizing. "This will disrupt their scanning fields," she explained. "It won't last long, but it will make it harder for them to pinpoint my location." As they worked, Edward found himself struck by her resilience. Despite her injuries and the looming threat, she exuded a quiet strength. It reminded him of his late wife, Claire, who had faced her cancer diagnosis with the same kind of unwavering resolve. "You're good under pressure," Edward said, his voice cutting through the hum of machinery. Alira paused, glancing at him. "Survival teaches you many things," she replied softly. "But I have never had an ally before." Edward chuckled, shaking his head. "Well, you've got one now." The first strike. The hum of the hunter's craft grew louder, accompanied by faint flashes of red light on the horizon. Edward and Alira moved to the living room, the farmhouse's windows now shuttered. Through a small gap in the curtains, Edward could see the faint silhouette of the craft, a sleek, angular shape that hovered silently above the field. "They're scanning," Alira whispered, "looking for bioelectric signatures. Your farm's isolation gives us some advantage, but it won't last." Edward tightened his grip on his old hunting rifle. "We'll make it last." As if on cue, a sharp beam of light pierced the darkness, sweeping across the field. Edward's pulse quickened as the beam approached the farmhouse. "Get down," he hissed, pulling Alira to the floor. The beam passed over them, its glow casting eerie shadows on the walls. Suddenly, a loud crack echoed through the night as one of Edward's rigged traps activated. Sparks flew from the field, and the hunter's craft jolted violently, its lights flickering. Edward allowed himself a grim smile. Looks like they didn't see that coming. But the reprieve was short-lived. The craft stabilized, and a new sound filled the air, a low, guttural hum that sent chills down Edward's spine. The hunters were angry. Face to face. Moments later, the farmhouse shook as something heavy landed on the porch. Edward grabbed his rifle, motioning for Alira to stay back. The door creaked open, and a tall figure stepped inside. It was humanoid but distinctly alien, its skin a dark, iridescent gray that seemed to ripple like liquid. Its eyes glowed a menacing red, scanning the room with cold precision. The hunter spoke in a guttural language, its voice a low growl that resonated in Edward's chest. Alira's translation bracelet crackled to life, rendering the words into halting English. "Surrender, the fugitive, and you will not be harmed." Edward stepped forward, his rifle raised. "You're trespassing," he said evenly. "Get off my property." The hunter's glowing eyes narrowed. "Your weapons are primitive. You cannot stop us." Edward smirked. "Maybe not, but I can slow you down." With that, he fired. The shot hit the hunter's shoulder, causing it to stagger backward. At the same moment, Alira activated her device, sending out a pulse that disrupted the hunter's scanning visor. The alien roared in frustration, clawing at its helmet as it sparked and fizzled. "Run," Edward shouted, grabbing Alira's arm. Together, they bolted through the back door, heading toward the barn. Behind them, the hunter let out a furious cry, its footsteps pounding against the floorboards. A narrow escape. The barn loomed ahead, its shadowy outline a beacon of hope. Inside, Edward had stashed a backup generator and additional supplies. If they could make it there, they might have a chance to regroup. As they ran, Edward glanced at Alira. Her human disguise had flickered off, revealing her alien form once more. Her face was set in a determined expression, her glowing eyes scanning the darkness for threats. Almost there, Edward panted, his lungs burning. Just a little further. But before they could reach the barn, another hunter appeared, stepping into their path. This one was smaller but no less menacing, its sleek form blending seamlessly with the shadows. It raised a weapon, a strange, glowing device that hummed with energy. Edward's mind raced. He had no time to think, only to act. Without hesitation, he shoved Alira behind him and raised his rifle. "Stay down," he shouted, firing a desperate shot. The bullet struck the weapon, causing it to explode in a shower of sparks. The hunter reeled back, momentarily disoriented. Edward grabbed Alira's hand, pulling her toward the barn. "Go, go, go." They reached the barn and slammed the door shut behind them. Edward quickly barricaded it with a heavy wooden beam, his chest heaving as he tried to catch his breath. Alira leaned against the wall, her glowing skin dimming slightly. "They won't stop," she said, her voice tinged with despair. Edward looked at her, his expression hardening. "Neither will we." For the first time in years, Edward felt a fire awaken within him, a resolve he thought he'd lost long ago. This wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about protecting something, someone worth fighting for, a bond forged in battle. The barn was dimly lit, the scent of hay and aged wood filling the air. Outside, the hum of the hunter's craft grew louder, the red lights piercing through the cracks in the old structure. Edward and Alira crouched behind a stack of crates, their breathing heavy but synchronized. The tension was palpable, yet amidst the chaos, a strange sense of unity bound them together. Alira adjusted her bracelet, the glow of its controls illuminating her iridescent skin. Her alien features, once otherworldly to Edward, now carried a familiarity he couldn't explain. "They will breach soon," she whispered, her voice steadied despite the danger. "They are relentless." Edward nodded, his hands tightening around the worn grip of his rifle. "Let them try. This is my land, and I'm not letting them take you." For a moment, Alira's kaleidoscopic eyes softened. "You don't owe me this. Why do you fight for me?" Edward glanced at her, the lines of his weathered face deepening as he spoke. "I've spent my life fixing things, solving problems. Doesn't matter if it's machines, crops, or people. If I see something worth saving, I save it." Her expression shifted, a flicker of something unspoken passing between them. Before she could respond, a deafening crash shook the barn. The hunters were here. The first stand. The doors splintered as a hulking figure stepped inside. The hunter was larger than the one Edward had encountered before, its armor gleaming like liquid obsidian. Its glowing red eyes scanned the barn, locking onto Edward and Alira almost instantly. "Stay behind me," Edward muttered, raising his rifle. The hunter moved with predatory precision, its heavy footsteps crunching against the straw-covered floor. Edward fired a shot, the bullet striking the creature's chest. Sparks flew, but the armor held. The hunter responded with a guttural growl, raising its weapon, a sleek, glowing rod that pulsed with ominous energy. Edward ducked as the weapon discharged, a beam of light slicing through the crates behind him. Splinters flew, and the barn filled with the acrid smell of burning wood. "Well, that's new," Edward muttered, reloading his rifle with practiced efficiency. Alira sprang into action, her bracelet emitting a sharp pulse of energy. The hunter staggered, its weapon fizzling out momentarily. "Now," she shouted. Edward didn't need to be told twice. He fired again, this time aiming for the exposed joints in the hunter's armor. The shot hit its mark, and the creature roared in pain, dropping its weapon. But before they could capitalize on the advantage, another crash signaled the arrival of reinforcements. Clever engineering. Edward's mind raced as two more hunters entered the barn. He knew they couldn't outgun their enemies, but years of tinkering and problem-solving had taught him one invaluable lesson. Sometimes, brains beat brawn. "Alira," he whispered, "can that bracelet of yours power up their weapons?" She blinked, understanding dawning in her eyes. "It can amplify their energy fields, yes. But why?" "Just do it. Trust me." Alira hesitated for only a moment before activating her bracelet. A faint hum filled the air as the hunter's weapons began to glow brighter, the energy crackling dangerously. The creatures hesitated, their glowing eyes darting to their malfunctioning gear. Edward seized the opportunity. "Overload," he muttered, flipping a switch on the backup generator he had rigged earlier. The surge of electricity sent a powerful pulse through the barn, colliding with the amplified energy from the hunter's weapons. The resulting explosion was deafening, a blinding flash of light engulfing the room. When the smoke cleared, the hunters lay motionless, their armor scorched, and their weapons destroyed. Edward coughed, waving away the haze as he checked on Alira. She was crouched behind a beam, unharmed but visibly shaken. "You did it," she said, her voice laced with awe. Edward grinned, though his knees trembled from the exertion. "Like I said, sometimes it's about fixing things." A quiet moment. For a brief moment, the world was still. The red lights from the hunter's craft had disappeared, and the hum of their engines had faded into the distance. Edward and Alira sat on the barn floor, catching their breath. "They'll be back," Alira said quietly, breaking the silence. "This isn't over." Edward nodded, his expression resolute. "Then we'll be ready." Alira studied him, her iridescent eyes reflecting the soft glow of the barn's lantern. "You're remarkable, Edward. Your people, your ingenuity. I didn't expect this." Edward chuckled, the sound dry but genuine. "Humans have a knack for surprises. We're not always the smartest or the strongest, but we're stubborn as hell." Alira tilted her head, a faint smile playing on her lips. "Stubbornness can be a virtue." Edward leaned back against the wall, his gaze drifting to the darkened horizon. "It can also get you into a lot of trouble." They shared a quiet laugh, the tension easing for a moment. But the weight of what lay ahead lingered in the air, unspoken but understood. They were two souls from different worlds, bound together by circumstance and a shared determination to survive. As the first rays of dawn began to pierce the cracks in the barn, Edward stood, offering a hand to Alira. "Come on. If we're going to face whatever's coming next, we'd better be ready." Alira took his hand, her grip firm and warm. Together, they stepped out into the morning light, ready to face the unknown, the unseen ally. The morning sun broke through the misty horizon, bathing the farm in a golden glow that belied the chaos of the night before. Edward and Alira stood at the edge of the field, surveying the damage. The barn bore the scars of the hunter's attack, splintered wood, scorch marks, and the faint hum of lingering alien energy. Despite the quiet, Edward's instincts told him the respite was temporary. "They will adapt," Alira murmured, her kaleidoscopic eyes scanning the tree line. "Hunters always do." Edward tightened his grip on the wrench in his hand. It wasn't much compared to the hunter's technology, but it was a familiar weight. "Then we'll adapt faster." Alira turned to him, a flicker of curiosity in her expression. "You are unusually resilient. Most species panic under such pressure." Edward smirked, though his gaze remained fixed on the horizon. "Humans don't panic. We improvise." An unexpected visitor. As they prepared to reinforce the farmhouse's defenses, a strange sound drew their attention. It wasn't the low hum of the hunter's craft, but something lighter, softer, a rhythmic pulse. Alira froze, her eyes narrowing. "That's not them." Edward followed the sound to the edge of the cornfield. The stalks rustled unnaturally, and a faint blue glow shimmered between the rows. He motioned for Alira to stay back as he approached cautiously. His heart pounded, but curiosity outweighed fear. From the shadows stepped a figure, a being unlike the hunters. Its form was lithe and humanoid, with skin that shimmered like polished bronze and eyes that glowed a soft, serene blue. It raised its hands in a gesture of peace, speaking in a melodic language that Alira quickly translated. "They are an ally," she said, stepping forward. "From my world." The stranger inclined their head, their voice carrying through Alira's bracelet. "I am Sivan. I was sent to find you." A message of hope. Sivan explained that they were a scout from Alira's homeworld, sent to locate her after her distress signal had been intercepted. The hunters weren't the only ones tracking her crash. Allies had followed as well. "We feared the worst," Sivan said, their glowing eyes meeting Alira's. "But it seems you found an unlikely protector." Edward raised an eyebrow, crossing his arms. "Glad to see I'm getting some credit around here." Sivan smiled, a surprisingly human expression. "Your actions speak for themselves, Edward Grey. Few would stand against the hunters as you have." Edward shrugged. Didn't feel like much of a choice. Sivan turned their attention to Alira, their tone growing serious. "The hunters won't stop until they retrieve the data you carry. We must leave before they regroup." Alira hesitated, glancing at Edward. "I can't. I owe him my life. I won't abandon him to face them alone." Edward held up a hand. "Now hold on. If leaving means you're safe, you go. I'll manage." Sivan stepped closer, their expression grave. "You misunderstand. The hunters won't leave once they've marked this location. They'll raise the land to ensure no traces remain. Your farm, your life, it's all at risk. A dangerous plan." The weight of Sivan's words settled heavily on Edward. His farm, his sanctuary, was now a battleground. He glanced at Alira, her resolve mirrored in her glowing eyes. "So what's the plan?" Sivan hesitated before speaking. "There is a way to draw them off. If we amplify the signal from Alira's bracelet, we can lure the hunters to a decoy location. But the process requires a power source, something strong enough to sustain the signal." Edward scratched his chin, his mind racing through the possibilities. His farm's old generator wouldn't cut it, but the nearby power substation might. It was risky, but it was their best shot. "We'll need to move fast," Edward said. "And we'll need bait." Alira stepped forward, determination etched into her features. "I will be the bait." "No," Edward said firmly. "Too dangerous." "She's right," Sivan interjected. "The hunter's technology is keyed to her bioelectric signature. She must be part of the decoy." Edward's jaw tightened, his instinct to protect her warring with the logic of their plan. Finally, he nodded. "All right. But if we're doing this, we're doing it my way." The final preparations. As the sun climbed higher, The trio worked tirelessly to prepare. Edward and Sivan rigged a portable amplifier to the power substation, while Alira calibrated her bracelet to emit the decoy signal. Every second felt like a countdown to the inevitable. When the preparations were complete, Edward stood back, surveying their makeshift setup. It wasn't perfect, but it would have to do. He turned to Alira, his expression softening. "You sure about this?" She nodded, her gaze unwavering. "If it means protecting you and your world, it's worth it." Edward chuckled, shaking his head. "You've got more guts than most humans I know." Sivan stepped forward, placing a hand on Alira's shoulder. "We will succeed. Together." As the sun dipped below the horizon, the trio braced themselves for the next wave. The hunters would come, and when they did, they would find more than they bargained for. The hunter's trap. Twilight settled over the farm, painting the sky in shades of deep violet and orange. The trio moved silently through the field, their steps muffled by the soft earth. Edward carried a duffel bag filled with tools and scraps he had hastily assembled, his last-minute additions to their plan. Beside him, Alira's bracelet emitted a faint rhythmic pulse, the signal slowly building in strength. Sivan walked ahead, their fluid movements almost ghost-like in the dim light. "We're close," Sivan whispered, their glowing blue eyes scanning the horizon. The power substation loomed in the distance, a silhouette of towering metal structures and thick cables. The hum of electricity filled the air, an ominous reminder of the power they were about to tap into. Edward adjusted the strap on his shoulder. "This place hasn't been used much since they built the new grid, but the backup system should still be functional." "Functional enough to amplify the signal?" Alira asked, her voice steady but tinged with apprehension. Edward glanced at her, a faint smile tugging at the corner of his lips. "If not, I'll make it functional." A growing unease. As they approached the substation, an unnatural stillness settled over the landscape. The usual sounds of the countryside, crickets, rustling leaves, the distant call of an owl, had vanished. Even the air felt heavier, as though it were holding its breath. "They're close," Alira murmured, her kaleidoscopic eyes darting toward the shadows. "The hunters can sense the signal." Sivan nodded, their voice low. "We need to move quickly. Once the decoy is active, they'll focus all their attention here." Edward placed a hand on Alira's shoulder, his grip firm but reassuring. "Stick to the plan. If anything goes wrong, you and Sivan get out of here. No arguments." Alira hesitated, then nodded. "And you?" Edward chuckled softly, though his eyes betrayed the weight of his thoughts. "I'll improvise." Activating the decoy. Inside the substation's control shed, Edward quickly got to work. The dusty consoles and faded monitors looked ancient, but the backup systems still hummed faintly. He connected Alira's bracelet to the amplifier they had rigged, the cables sparking as they latched onto the power source. "Careful," Sivan warned, their gaze fixed on the glowing device. The energy surge could destabilize the field. Edward grunted, tightening the connections. "Just keep an eye out for our uninvited guests." Alira stood near the entrance, her senses heightened. The faint hum of her bracelet grew louder, reverberating through the room. "It's working," she said, her voice a mix of relief and tension. "The signal is amplifying." Outside, the faint red lights of the hunter's craft appeared on the horizon, moving steadily toward the substation. The hum of their engines grew louder, a sound that seemed to vibrate through the ground itself. "They're coming," Sivan said, their voice calm but urgent. The first encounter. The hunters didn't wait long. A deafening roar announced their arrival as one of their crafts descended, its sleek form casting an ominous shadow over the substation. Edward, Alira, and Sivan ducked behind the control shed as a burst of light shot out, illuminating the area. "They're scanning for movement," Alira whispered. "If they detect us." "They won't," Edward interrupted, flipping a final switch on the console. The decoy signal surged to life, emitting a blinding pulse of light that lit up the night. The hunter's craft jolted, its lights flickering as it adjusted to the sudden surge of energy. For a moment, it worked. The craft shifted its focus to the decoy, its scanning beam locked onto the glowing device. But then, with an unsettling precision, the beam snapped toward the control shed. "They know," Sci-Fi said sharply. "They've adapted." Edward's gamble. Edward's mind raced. The hunters had outsmarted the decoy faster than he had anticipated, and now they were closing in. He glanced at Elira and Sci-Fi, their faces etched with concern. Time for Plan B. Elira frowned. "What's Plan B?" Edward grinned, though his eyes carried a glint of mischief. "Improvisation." Before they could protest, Edward grabbed the duffel bag and bolted toward the substation's open yard. He reached into the bag, pulling out a bundle of wires and an old propane tank he had modified earlier. The hunter's scanning beam locked onto him instantly, their craft descending lower. "Edward, no," Elira shouted, stepping forward, but Sci-Fi held her back. "He knows what he's doing," Sci-Fi said, though their voice wavered. Edward placed the propane tank near one of the substation's transformers, connecting it to the wires he had been carrying. The hunter's craft hovered mere feet above him now, its ominous hum drowning out all other sounds. Edward could see the faint outlines of figures inside, their glowing red eyes fixed on him. "Come on," he muttered under his breath, his hands working quickly to rig the device. Just a little closer. A blinding explosion. The hunters fired, a searing beam of light tearing through the air. Edward dove behind the transformer just as the shot connected with the propane tank. The explosion was instantaneous, a deafening roar that sent a wave of heat and debris into the night sky. The hunter's craft was caught in the blast, its sleek form spinning out of control before crashing into the nearby field. Elira and Sci-Fi rushed to Edward's side, their expressions a mix of relief and shock. Edward sat up, coughing but grinning. "Told you I'd improvise." "You're insane," Elira said, though her voice carried a hint of admiration. Sci-Fi helped Edward to his feet, their glowing eyes scanning the horizon. "More will come. We've bought time, but not much." Edward dusted himself off, his grin fading. "Then let's make it count." The trio retreated into the shadows, the burning wreckage of the hunter's craft lighting their path as they prepared for the final phase of their plan. The final gambit. The wreckage of the hunter's craft smoldered in the field, casting eerie shadows across the landscape. Edward, Elira, and Sci-Fi huddled beneath the cover of a grove of trees just beyond the substation. The explosion had bought them precious moments, but the reprieve wouldn't last. The hunters were relentless, and Edward knew their next move would be even more calculated. "They'll send reinforcements," Sci-Fi said, their calm voice masking the tension in their glowing eyes. This was a scout ship. The main fleet won't be far behind. Edward wiped the sweat and soot from his face, his mind racing. "Then we need to end this before they get here. What's their weakness? There's gotta be something." Elira hesitated, her kaleidoscopic eyes flickering with uncertainty. "Their ships rely on a centralized command relay to coordinate their movements. If we can disable it, we can throw them into disarray," Edward finished, nodding. "Where's the relay?" Sci-Fi's expression darkened. "It's aboard their flagship, heavily guarded." Edward smirked, a spark of defiance lighting his eyes. "Good. Let's pay them a visit. A risky alliance." Sci-Fi stepped forward, their voice cautious. "The flagship's defenses are impenetrable without advanced tech. Even with Elira's data, it's near suicide." Edward glanced at the shimmering remains of the hunter's craft, an idea forming in his mind. What if we use their tech against them? Elira tilted her head, intrigued. "What are you suggesting?" Edward knelt, sifting through the debris of the downed ship. He found a charred console, its glowing interface flickering faintly. "If we can patch into their systems, maybe we can hijack one of their smaller ships, fly straight to the flagship." Sci-Fi's eyes widened. "That's bold." Edward shrugged, grinning. Bold's what we've got." The three of them worked quickly, salvaging components from the wreckage. Alira's bracelet served as the key to bypassing the hunter's encryption, her nimble fingers moving with practiced precision. Sci-Fi modified the ship's propulsion systems, their movements fluid and efficient. Edward, ever the problem solver, rigged together a makeshift cockpit from salvaged controls. "Ready," Alira announced, her voice steady despite the weight of the moment. Edward placed a hand on her shoulder, his gaze serious. "You don't have to come, you know. This isn't your fight." Alira met his eyes, her expression resolute. "It is now." Infiltrating the flagship, the stolen craft hummed to life, its sleek form cutting through the night sky. Alira sat at the controls, her iridescent skin glowing faintly in the dim cockpit. Edward and Sci-Fi strapped into the rear seats, their eyes fixed on the horizon. As they approached the flagship, its massive silhouette loomed like a dark monolith against the stars. The ship was bristling with weaponry, its surface alive with faint red lights that seemed to pulse in time with the hunter's ominous hum. "They're scanning us," Alira said, her hand steady on the controls. "I'm masking our signal, but it won't last long." Edward leaned forward, his eyes narrowing. "How close can you get us?" "Close enough," she replied, her voice laced with determination. The stolen craft slipped into the flagship's docking bay, its holographic signature disguising it as one of the hunter's own. The trio moved quickly, exiting the ship and blending into the shadows of the cavernous hangar. "Where's the relay?" Edward whispered. Sci-Fi activated a small device, a holographic map flickering to life. "Central command deck, 3 levels up." Edward grinned, checking the makeshift weapon he had rigged from the hunter's tech. "Let's crash the party." The heart of the beast. The corridors of the flagship were cold and sterile, the faint hum of alien machinery echoing through the halls. The trio moved with precision, avoiding patrols and slipping past security checkpoints. Alira's bracelet emitted a soft pulse, disrupting the surveillance systems as they passed. When they reached the command deck, the relay stood at the center, a towering structure of pulsing energy and glowing circuits. It was guarded by 2 hunters, their red eyes scanning the room with mechanical precision. Edward turned to Alira and Sci-Fi, his voice low. "I'll distract them. You take out the relay." Sci-Fi frowned. "You're outmatched." "This isn't." "Not up for debate," Edward interrupted, a wry smile playing on his lips. "Besides, improvisation's kind of my thing." Before they could protest, Edward stepped into the open, his makeshift weapon raised. The hunters turned instantly, their guttural voices barking commands. Edward fired, the weapon's pulse striking one of the hunters and sending it sprawling. "Over here, you tin cans," Edward shouted, retreating deeper into the corridor and drawing the hunters after him. A desperate act. With the hunters distracted, Alira and Sci-Fi moved swiftly to the relay. Sci-Fi began dismantling its outer casing, exposing the chaotic web of circuits and energy conduits. Alira cinched her bracelet to the relay, her hands a blur as she worked. "We need a surge," Alira said, her voice tight with concentration. "Something to overload the system." Sci-Fi glanced at her, their expression grim. "If we overload it, the explosion will take out this entire section." Alira hesitated, her gaze flickering toward the corridor where Edward had disappeared. "Do it." Sci-Fi nodded, their hands moving with practiced efficiency. The relay began to pulse erratically, its glow intensifying. Edward appeared moments later, his weapon smoking. "What's the holdup?" "Run," Alira shouted. The 3 of them bolted as the relay reached critical mass. Behind them, a deafening explosion tore through the command deck, sending shockwaves rippling through the flagship. Escape and resolve. The stolen craft barely made it out of the flagship as it erupted in a cascade of fire and light. The hunters' fleet descended into chaos, their ships veering wildly as they lost their coordination. Edward, Alira, and Sci-Fi watched from the safety of the craft, the enormity of their actions sinking in. "We did it," Alira whispered, her voice filled with awe. Edward leaned back in his seat, a weary grin spreading across his face. "Told you we'd improvise." Sivan turned to them, their glowing eyes softening. "You risked everything for this. For us." Edward shrugged, his gaze fixed on the burning flagship. "That's what humans do. We fight for what matters." As the stars stretched out before them, the trio shared a quiet moment of triumph. The battle was over, but their journey was just beginning. Together, they had faced the impossible and won.